pay higher fuel prices with the carbon tax, and his response was a bit jarring. He said yes, and that's what Canadians expect because that is leadership. Well, Mr. Speaker, what the Prime Minister views as leadership is literally terrifying to widows and single moms across this country. But at the very least, they deserve to know one thing. How much will the carbon tax cost them?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives are yet again demonstrating not just their tenuous relationship with the truth, but also with the understanding that we have to take concrete action on carbon. After 10 long years of the Harper Conservatives doing absolutely nothing on the environment, the same Conservatives show they just don't get it. We are putting a price on carbon pollution because it will reduce emissions and drive growth in the right direction at the same time. While Harper Conservatives believe that by making the economy and the environment work together, somehow Canada is broken, we will continue to invest in clean technology.
Honourable Member for Milton.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister and his lead ministers simply don't seem to understand. They're very much out of touch with the reality of what's happening and the gravity of the issue that we're speaking of. I remember the days, Mr. Speaker, and a lot of us do, about being able to put just $5 in the gas tank in order to get to my work at the Dairy Queen. And there are people like that today in my riding who experience that. This is a serious matter that's going to affect the affordability of life for many Canadians. His department knows how much it costs. Why won't he tell them?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, we are putting in place practical, low-cost measures to tackle climate change and drive clean growth, including pricing pollution. It is clear that the Conservatives have no intention of taking climate change seriously and have no plan to promote clean growth in Canada. This is exactly the kind of inaction we saw in 10 years under Stephen Harper, who still very much apparently controls the backbench of the Conservative Party. And these Conservatives are no different.
Order. The Honourable Member for Central, Coast of Bay, Central Notre Dame will come to order. The Honourable Member for Milton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister said that he wants to increase the carbon tax, he wants to put it on goods, because he believes that Canadians need to be told to make better choices. Basically, he's running on the no pain, no gain platform. But the reality is this, Mr. Speaker, we don't know how much the pain will be. Or is this just a real issue of the fact that it's all pain and no gain?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I suggest the honourable member actually talk to some of her colleagues from British Columbia, where they have had a price on carbon pollution for years and have among the strongest economic growth in the country. 85% of Canadians now live in jurisdictions where they put a price on carbon pollution, and Canadians understand that growing the economy at the same time as we protect the environment is the only way forward. The Harper Conservatives still demonstrate they don't get it. They're stuck in what they were doing for 10 years. Canadians had enough.
That's right. L'honorable député.
The Honourable Member for Louis Saint Laurent. And so, Mr. Speaker, this is what the Conservatives did for 10 years, and it comes from a document from the Department of Natural Resources. Greenhouse gas emissions went down by 2.2%, and the GDP went up by 16.9%. That's what the Conservatives did.
Ça fonctionne?
It's working? I'm sorry, I had trouble hearing the Honourable Member. The microphone here was open. It is now closed, and the member for Louis Saint Laurent has the floor. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's with great pleasure I will repeat what I said, because it is the truth, and it comes from the Department of Natural Resources of Canada. The Conservative track record from 2005 to 2015 was lower greenhouse gas emissions by 2.2%, and the GDP went up by 16.9%. That's the Conservative track record. Greenhouse gas is down, and better economy, and we did it without the Liberal carbon tax. Why does the Prime Minister want to impose a new tax on Canadians? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, if these Conservatives want to lead another election campaign on the basis of how they did well during the Harper years, I invite them to do so. Canadians rejected Harper's approach, which had the worst track record for economic growth since the Great Depression, who could not create the energy projects and get them to new markets. Those all failed. They did not deliver to Canadians what they needed to. Canadians made a choice and they rejected Harper and his Conservatives. The Honourable Member for Louis Saint Laurent. Mr. Speaker, I think the Prime Minister made his choice. He's setting aside the truth and facts. We lowered greenhouse gas emissions and improved the economy. The facts are that the Prime Minister has in his hands, as part of the Council of Ministers, he has a document that indicates how much more it's going to cost Canadian families to implement the Liberal carbon tax. Can the Prime Minister be honest with Canadians and table this document so that Canadians know exactly how much the Liberal carbon tax will cost them? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, to make things clear, economic growth that occurred during the Harper years was the worst since the Great Depression among all Canadian Prime Ministers. For 2.5 years, by investing more money into the middle class, by investing in infrastructure, by demonstrating that leadership in the environment and the economy go together, we have the best track record for growth among G7 countries last year. And we are creating 600,000 new jobs. That is our track record, and that's what Canadians chose. The Honourable Member for Rimouski-Neigette, Témiscouata, Basque. October 27, 2016 is a problematic date for the Prime Minister. It's the date where Indigenous groups were told that no decision had been made in the Kinder Morgan file. But a few minutes later, 6 organizations heard the Assistant Deputy Minister Aaron O'Gorman order staff to provide Cabinet a legally sound basis to say yes to this project. None of the representatives denied that these things were said. The only ones to deny it are the Prime Minister and his Minister of Natural Resources. Will they make public all the documents about this project's approval? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, the Federal Court of Appeal clearly indicated that the Harper government had not sufficiently consulted Indigenous peoples about energy projects. Our government held the broadest consultations among rights holders in the history of this country, and we set up the Oversight Committee, whose role was defined alongside with Indigenous groups. 43 Indigenous communities signed agreements, and for the first time in Canada's history, many Indigenous peoples took part in the process. They were able to extract benefits from it. The Honourable Member for Rimouski-Neigette, Témiscouata, Basque.
2016, Indigenous groups were told that no decision had been made in the Kinder Morgan project. Fact, minutes later, in a meeting of 6 organizations, a top government official instructed her staff to give the Cabinet a legally sound basis for saying yes to the project. None of these present denied that this has been said. In fact, one participant actually confirmed, and I quote, "I was rather shocked at being given that kind of direction. It's not something I expected from a Liberal government." Will the Prime Minister release all the information on the approval of the Kinder Morgan project?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Actually did was improve the process by adding additional steps and additional consultations to the flawed process put in place by the Harper government. We know, Mr. Speaker, that the moving forward on resources requires that we demonstrate leadership on the environment and a plan to grow the economy sustainably. That's exactly what we did. We strengthened the approval process. We did extra consultations, and we are moving forward with the project in the national interest.
The Honourable Member for Laurier-Sainte-Marie. Mr. Speaker, we found out today that the government is trying to negotiate an invisible wall for asylum seekers. Publicly, the Prime Minister says that he wants to welcome refugees, but behind closed doors, there's an attempt to send them back to the United States. The ministers responsible refuse to answer questions. Can the government be clear and tell us if it is true that it is attempting to renegotiate the Safe Third Country Agreement? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, it's been months that we've been having conversations with our American partners on many issues having to do with our borders. That's what Canadians expect of us. The Safe Third Country Agreement allows for a good management of asylum requests. The United Nations indicates that people must make their request for asylum in the first safe country they arrive in. It is unfortunate that the NDP is using conservative tactics to convince Canadians to be afraid. We are moving forward with a compassionate approach that will make sure that those who should remain in Canada can do so.
For Vancouver East.
When the cameras are rolling, the Prime Minister wants people to regard him as a global humanitarian. But behind closed doors, Mr. Speaker, his government is quietly working to shut down Canada's border to asylum seekers who are forced to risk life and limb to get to safety. And this has been happening since September of last year. The double talk doesn't stop there. It was just last week that his Minister of Immigration said having one continuous official border crossing all 9,000 kilometers is, quote, not a real solution. Liberals and Conservatives, what's the difference?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, in Canada, we are incredibly fortunate that Canadians look at immigrants and refugees across party lines as a potential benefit to Canada, as nation builders, not just as immigrants or refugees. We know that being compassionate and welcoming is one of the great strengths of Canada, but we also know that applying the rules and the laws around our immigration system is essential for fairness, but it's also essential to ensure continued support for immigration and refugees. That is exactly what we are doing. We are going to remain compassionate while ensuring that our laws are enforced.
Honourable Member for Carleton.
For the Finance Minister, today in the Finance Committee, government officials admitted they have modeled the cost of the carbon tax to Canadian families.
There you go.
But then when I asked if they would just share those calculations with the committee and with the people who will have to pay those taxes, the official said he cannot do that at this time. So what the government wants is for Canadians to write a blank check wherein the amounts will be written after that check is in the hands of the government. Why won't the Finance Minister end his carbon tax cover-up and tell us what this tax would cost Canadians?
Honourable Minister of Environment.
That the member opposite didn't read the report that was released yesterday. Clear evidence that what? Putting a price on pollution works. And it also, you can do that while growing a clean economy. We make decisions based on evidence. But I've got a question for the member opposite. What would his party do to tackle climate change? Do they even believe it's real? Because they have no plan.
Hear, hear.
Order. The Honourable Member for Carleton.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's disappointing that the Finance Minister is still in hiding and can't answer questions about his own budget. But we'll find out if there's anyone over there who can answer this question. Today, gas prices in Vancouver have reached a record $1.60. Consumers are suffering. Families are paying more, and it's going to get a lot worse under this proposed Liberal carbon tax. The government knows how much this tax will cost families. Why won't they tell Canadians how much will it cost the average family?
The Minister of Environment.
Mr. Speaker, I wish the member opposite wouldn't mislead people from British Columbia. If he understood economics, he'd understand why the price is higher for gas in BC. It actually has to do with the supply and demand issue. It has to do with exchange rates. We understand that polluting is not free. There is a real cost on Canadians, and I wish he could tell all the kids that are watching Question Period right now what he would do to ensure a more sustainable future for them.
Member for Carleton.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it might be a lot more sustainable if they would let us, as Canadians, build a pipeline to bring our own petroleum to its market. But back to the matter at hand, there is no question that this carbon tax will raise the price of gasoline. The minister's own document says that it will go up by at least 11 cents, and that's if you believe their numbers. They also know how much this tax will cost the average Canadian family, but nobody will answer over there. Why won't they end this cover-up and tell us how much this tax will cost?
Honourable Minister of Environment.
Speaker, I am happy after question period to hand over our analysis that shows that carbon pricing works, that you can do it while growing the economy. 80% of Canadians live in a province, Ontario, British Columbia, Alberta, and Quebec, where there's a price on pollution. And guess what? Their economies were the fastest growing in the country. Once again, I asked the member opposite, what are you going to do? Under 10 years of the Harper government, you did nothing.
Order. I remind the Honourable Minister of Environment to direct her comments to the Chair. When we say you in here, we're talking about the Speaker, of course. The Honourable Member for Carleton.
Mr. Speaker, the Environment Minister can't answer the question about how much this tax will cost Canadians. The Finance Minister won't answer the question about how much this will cost Canadians. The Prime Minister was unable to answer the question. So I'm trying to figure out which of these ministers has the answer. Why don't we just ask them all? How much? How much? How much? How much? How much? How much? How much will this carbon tax cost Canadians?
The Honourable Minister of Environment.
I have a question.
Order.
What's your climate plan? What's your climate plan? What's your climate plan? What's your climate plan?
The Honourable Member for Carleton.
Well, she should know because she actually followed the Conservative targets on climate change. We actually saw greenhouse gases go down at the same time as taxes went down under the previous Conservative government. We saved people money while protecting the economy. Now, will they finally answer the question, how much will a Canadian family have to pay for this new Liberal carbon tax?
Honourable Minister of Environment.
Mr. Speaker, I wish that the party opposite would understand the costs of climate change right now. One of the hardest calls I ever had to do was to a rancher in Alberta, whose whole ranch burned down because of forest fires. There are people that are suffering from floods across the country. The Arctic is literally thawing, and they think it's a joke.
Order. I have no trouble hearing the question. We also need to hear the answer. Order. I'd ask the members for Kitchener-Conestoga and others, not to speak until it's their turn to speak. The Honourable Minister of Environment has the floor. Order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's a real cost of climate change right now, and Canadians across the country are feeling it. That we have people that are fearing the impacts of forest fires, of floods, of droughts. The Arctic is literally melting, but they think it's a joke. No, we are taking serious action on climate change. We have a plan, and we have a target, and we're going to meet it.
Member for Carleton.
Actually, they just released a document yesterday saying they won't meet their plan. They say they won't meet their target. They'll come about 90 million tons short of meeting their target, and that's with their carbon tax. She said she spoke to a rancher in Alberta. Did she tell that rancher how much this carbon tax would cost him and his family?
Minister of Environment.
I don't know how I can make it more clear. Maybe the member opposite could go call the insurance companies, because insurance companies tell me every day the huge payouts that they're having to pay because of the cost of climate change. Let me also talk about the opportunity, the $23 trillion opportunity, as Mark Carney, the governor of Bank of England, has called it, of clean growth. This party doesn't understand that we need to protect our environment and grow in our economy. We're going to do both. They will do neither.
Honorable député de Boulogne.
The Honourable Member for Belleuil-Chambly. Mr. Speaker, a reporter told us that the Department of Justice fought hard to have a Canadian extradited Hassan Diab, even if the file did not have enough evidence or evidence that was unreliable. This was done in spite of human rights extended to every Canadian citizen. What has Canada been doing since Mr. Diab has been returned to ensure that this nightmare never happens again? The Honourable Minister of Foreign Affairs. We have fought for the return of Mr. Diab in Canada. That was a very important issue for all of us. We are delighted that he is back in Canada. We are aware of the reports of involvement of federal public servants in his extradition. That happened under the previous government. I think it is important to take that into account. The Honourable Member for Belleuil-Chambly.
The government was using low burden of proof to extradite Mr. Diab to France, a burden of proof that was so insufficient that it didn't hold up in a French court. And Mr. Speaker, in a 2006 Supreme Court ruling, the court said that courts have to stop rubber stamping foreign extradition requests and start weighing evidence presented by foreign countries. So can the minister explain how the Department of Justice is supposed to deal with this issue when they're investigating themselves, and when will they actually fix this broken extradition system that people are paying with their livelihood?
Honourable Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Glad to have that question. We advocated at every level for Mr. Diab's return to Canada. It is an issue that I took very personally, and I am very glad he is back home in Canada with his family. I have read the reports of the involvement of government officials in his extradition. This happened under the previous Harper government, and I think that this is indeed a matter which it is important to look into.
The Honourable Member for Richmond Centre.
It's past 7 minutes. And I said, no, it's not.
Mr. Speaker, this year, thousands of people will cross into Canada illegally. The Prime Minister created this mess with his tweet, and he's providing special treatment to those who skip the line and enter Canada illegally. What message does this send to the thousands of immigrants that have followed the rules?
What the party opposite does not seem to understand is that we can be both. We can both protect the security and safety of Canadians while meeting our international obligations for refugee protection. We have a proud record of doing both. The party opposite wants to set one group of immigrants against another, and that is the politics of division and fear that Canadians rejected in 2015.
The member for Richmond Centre.
I've heard from our constituents who are frustrated by wait time to sponsor their families. While there's a strict limit on the number of family members that can come to Canada, yet there seems to be no limit to the number of illegal border crossings that are allowed in. Can the Prime Minister please explain how it is fair to keep families apart while awarding those who break the law?
The party opposite is trying to muddy the waters. They know very clearly that refugees are processed in a different stream with the Immigration Refugee Board, and that other immigrants are processed by Immigration Refugee Citizenship Canada. But let's talk about processing times. Processing times under the Conservatives for spouses were more than 26 months or longer. Spouses and children and families were kept apart for a very long time. We brought that down to 12 months or less. Let's talk about living caregiver program. Families were kept apart between 5 to 7 years, Mr. Speaker. We've reduced that by 12 months or less. Mr. Speaker, we have a great...
Honourable Member for Edmonton Manning.
Mr. Speaker, the Liberals are mismanaging our immigration system. In just the past year, over 20,000 asylum seekers have illegally crossed the borders into Canada. This Prime Minister's policy is encouraging illegal immigrants to jump the queue while those who follow the rules have to wait longer. Can the Prime Minister explain to me how is that fair?
Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman needs to understand the rules. In fact, when someone crosses the border inconsistently with the rules, they are arrested, they are questioned, they are identified both biographically and biometrically. Their identity is checked against every Canadian and U.S. database for any immigration or criminal or security flags. And then they are required, Mr. Speaker, to in fact prove the necessity for protection from Canada. If they cannot prove that, Mr. Speaker, their admissibility is denied and they are removed from the country.
Honourable member for Edmonton Manning.
Well, Canadians like Roxana have been trying to privately sponsor a refugee from Djibouti, and the wait time is up to 7 years long. Yet, there are people who are walking across the borders illegally and immediately getting to stay in Canada. Canadians and those who wish to come to Canada legally are frustrated. Why is the Prime Minister rewarding those who break the law and punishing those who play by the rules?
Honourable Minister of Immigration.
Committed to a system of immigration that puts priority on the safety and security of Canadians while continuing to meet our international obligations. But let's talk about their record, Mr. Speaker. They had an abysmal record when it comes to refugees, privately sponsored or government sponsored. They cut refugee health care, Mr. Speaker. They pit one group of immigrants against another, Mr. Speaker. That is the politics of fear and division that Canadians resoundingly rejected in 2015. And with rhetoric like that, they'll spend another decade in opposition, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Député de Rosemont, la Petite Patrie.
The Honourable Member for Rosemont, la Petite Patrie. We all know the story. It's Monday morning, and a student suddenly realizes that he hasn't done the homework that's due today. Jumps in the school bus and scribbles an assignment along the way. Usually the result isn't too impressive. But that's exactly what's happening with the Liberals and their electoral reform. In November 2016, they tabled a bill, then they fell asleep at the switch. And now they're suddenly waking up, after having broken their main electoral promise. Why table a bill that likely won't even take effect before the next election? Honourable President of the Treasury Board.
Speaker, C-76 will strengthen Canada's electoral system, and it will increase the participation of Canadians in our electoral process. I spoke to the acting chief electoral officer yesterday, in fact, about the legislation and the potential to increase the transparency of our electoral process, to make elections more accessible and the electoral process more secure is an important one, and that's why this bill, it's important that we pass this through Parliament and the Senate, and it's important that we continue to make sure that it is in place, in fact, for the next election. I have every confidence it will be.
Honourable Member for Skeena-Balcony Valley.
It was so important to them that they sat on the bill for a year and a half. They just introduced a 250-page omnibus voting bill, which is kind of ironic. Coincidentally, also yesterday was Elections Canada's deadline to pass legislation so they can run our elections fairly. After hitting the snooze button for more than a year and a half, Liberals are now reaching out for the panic button. You'd think after betraying his promise that 2015 was the last election under first past the post, the Prime Minister would have at least gotten his homework in on time. So my question is simple. The voting system doesn't belong to Liberals, it belongs to all Canadians. Will they commit to cross-country hearings so that all Canadians can have their voices heard?
Honourable President of the Treasury Board.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question. I also thank the New Democrats for what they said yesterday, that they actually agree with some of the provisions in C-76. And in fact, they agree broadly with the principles that C-76 that can actually strengthen our democratic process. Mr. Speaker, 85% of the recommendations of Elections Canada are in fact proposals in C-76. So we have every confidence that Elections Canada can make this work before the next election.
Honourable Member for Vaughan Woodbridge.
Mr. Speaker, last November, this government announced Canada's very first national housing strategy. That's $40 billion over 10 years to put housing first for more Canadians.
Responsible for Housing joined his Ontario counterpart to sign the first bilateral housing agreement under the National Housing Strategy. Could the Minister tell the House how this agreement will provide housing relief for all Ontario residents?
Great question. Sir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like first to commend the member from Vaughan Woodbridge for his tremendous work in support of the housing needs of his constituents. L'entente d'hier prévoit des investissements.
Yesterday's agreement involves new investments of $4 billion to support families in Ontario.
Is going to build and repair more homes, is going to protect 130,000 Ontarian families from the risk of losing their community home, and will help deliver the new Canada housing benefit. Mr. Speaker, we're back in supporting the housing needs of Canadians, and we're there to stay.
The Honourable Member for Charlotte-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, this morning the newspaper Le Soleil published a letter from the Minister of Immigration lamenting that the solutions proposed by the Conservatives to stop illegal immigrants from entering the country wouldn't solve anything. But the Liberals are currently negotiating changes to the Safe Third Country Agreement with the Americans. Can the Minister tell us exactly what is being negotiated? The Honourable Minister of Transport. Mr. Speaker, as we've said many times, we believe in a system that will welcome refugees as long as the rules are followed. That is why we are working closely with the provinces, including Quebec and Ontario. And of course, we are constantly in dialogue with our neighbors. Our American neighbors are facing a lot of issues, and this situation concerns them too. So we are talking to them, and we will continue to do so that we can manage the situation. Thank you. The Honourable Member for Charlotte-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, I would have liked to have an answer from the Minister of Immigration, but now I'd like to know, is the Minister saying that the U.S. Homeland Security Agency is lying when they say that they're negotiating with the Government of Canada? Is the Minister ready to continue down this path just to play a political game because he can't admit that the solution proposed by the Conservatives is the best solution? How can we trust this government? Who's telling the truth? The Honourable Minister of Transport. Mr. Speaker, I'm very proud to be the chair of the working group that is managing this file. I am also qualified to answer that question. I certainly didn't appreciate my colleague's comment at the beginning of his question. We are working on this issue. We are working with the province of Quebec and the province of Ontario and the other provinces, and of course with the United States as well, to manage this situation, and we will continue to do so.
For Calgary Nose Hill.
Today, the American Department of Homeland Security told Canadian media that they are considering Canadian proposals to amend the Safe Third Country Agreement. After a full year of Conservatives demanding that this loophole that incents people to illegally enter Canada, while hundreds of thousands of others wait years to legally enter the country, we found out from the Americans that in spite of the minister stating on the record otherwise, that there were, quote, proposals on the table. What are those proposals?
Honourable Minister of Immigration.
As I've stated a number of times, we continuously work with our American counterparts on all issues related to our common border, including discussions related to the Safe Third Country Agreement. What I have also stated on the record numerous times is that there are no formal negotiations with respect to the Safe Third Country Agreement. What I find very rich is the party opposite talking about the border and about immigration processing when their record on both of those issues is abysmal, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Calgary Nose Hill.
Let me tell you what that's code for, Mr. Speaker. Our hashtag Welcome to Canada Prime Minister doesn't want to walk his tweet back and alienate NDP voters, so he's happy to negotiate in secret with the Americans, and then hopes that he can blame their delay for his lack of political will. In the meantime, tens of thousands of people have and continue to illegally stream across our borders. So how will the Americans, or anyone, take the Prime Minister seriously when he's pandering for votes instead of managing our borders?
The Honourable Minister of Immigration.
Mr. Speaker, unlike the party opposite, we view immigration as mattering to each and every individual that comes to Canada. That is why we improved processing times. That is why we welcomed over 51,000 Syrian refugees. That is why, under our leadership, we've been able to provide a home to 1,300 survivors of Daesh atrocities. What was their record under their watch? They brought a grand total of 3 Yazidi refugees to Canada, Mr. Speaker. What was their record in terms of treatment of refugees? They cut refugee health care to the most vulnerable, pregnant women, victims of torture. That is their record, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Disnethi, Mississippi, Churchill River.
First Nations leaders are discussing federal legislation and whether or not this government is committed to the free, prior, and informed consent of First Nations people. The government has said its most important relationship is with Indigenous peoples. But when it comes to implementing Indigenous languages and protecting First Nations land and water, little has been done. When can the First Nations expect progress, and how has the government implemented free, prior, and informed principles into their agenda?
The Honourable Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the member for the question and for her ongoing advocacy on all issues related to Indigenous people in this country. The Government of Canada does believe that the relationship with Indigenous people is the most important, and as stated in the mandate letter of every minister, this new relationship must be based on the recognition of rights, respect, cooperation and partnership, and that is being fed into the new legal framework for rights recognition, as well as into the very important legislation being brought forward by the Minister of Heritage.
Honourable Member for Timmins, James Bay.
Speaker, the work of reconciliation is far from done, but today is a good day, a historic day, as the Parliament of Canada reaches out directly to Pope Francis to ask him to work with us and to issue that formal apology for the Catholic Church's role in establishing, running, and covering up the crimes of the residential schools. To the Prime Minister, what formal steps will he take to express the will of Parliament to Pope Francis and to call on the Catholic bishops to pay the proper compensation for the crimes? It's about moral leadership.
Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the member also for his ongoing advocacy, and particularly with respect to this issue. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action provide a roadmap for the journey of reconciliation, and our government, as you know, is committed to working with partners, all partners, to ensure all calls to action are implemented. Call to Action 58 calls on the Pope to issue an apology to residential school survivors, their families, and communities. I have written to the Canadian Council of Catholic Bishops to request a meeting to move this important step forward and hope that they will meet directly with survivors. I look.
The Honourable Member for Caribou, Prince George.
Mr. Speaker, we're hearing news that surf clam workers in Grand Bank are already having their hours cut. The minister says he has a plan. The minister says he stands with the people of Grand Bank. Will he stand with them on the unemployment line when they're struggling to find jobs? Will he stand with them when they're struggling to feed their families, or pay their mortgages, or send their kids to summer camp? If the minister is truly committed to standing with the people of Grand Bank, will he reverse his corrupt surf clam decision, recuse himself, and restart the process?
Order. I would ask members to be careful in the terms of what kinds of wording they use in the House. We don't call each other corrupt on either side around here. The Honourable Minister of Fisheries.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I've explained in this House a number of times, our government made a decision to include a new entrant in this important fishery. We thought it was also important to have significant Indigenous benefits from this decision. We're proud that a partnership was formed between a company with experience in offshore fisheries and Indigenous communities from 5 provinces, 4 Atlantic Canadian provinces, and Quebec. Mr. Speaker, we also understand the importance of the facility in Grand Bank, and we think the member should be careful not to raise fears unreasonably in that community, as he's done from the beginning.
Member for Caribou, Prince George.
But, Mr. Speaker, today we learned his Liberal friends that have all this experience now admit they won't be surfing the clam fishing or surf clam this season, and maybe not even next season, Mr. Speaker. Why? Because they don't have a boat. They gave the lucrative quota to his Liberal buddies, knowing full well their application did not meet critical bid criteria. If the Liberal MPs from the Rock won't say it, looking after his Liberal buddies is shameful. Given this new information, will the minister finally do the right thing and reverse this questionable decision?
Mr. of Fisheries.
Mr. Speaker, as I've had a chance to explain in this House before, the previous Conservative government, in fact, had a plan in 2014 and 2015 to bring a new entrant into this fishery. So if they were going to include a new entrant in this fishery, it's obvious at that time that their concern for the people of Grand Bank had somehow been forgotten, because that decision would have had exactly the same consequences that they're now exaggerating for the people of Grand Bank. But, Mr. Speaker, what they forgot to do in that process was include Indigenous communities, and we're proud to have done so, and that's why we're proud of this decision.
The Honourable Member for Carlton Trail, Eagle Creek.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Delays in passing legislative changes to improve the rail transportation system are entirely of the Liberals' own making. They wasted over a year between receiving the Emerson report and introducing Bill C-49. Now, the Liberals are rejecting reasonable amendments that will improve the legislation for grain shippers. Mr. Speaker, this may well be the strangest question you will hear today. But when will the government stop messing around and pass their own bill?
Good question. Minister of Transport.
Well, I certainly hope, Mr. Speaker, with the cooperation of the Harper Conservatives, that we're going to be able to do it as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, they don't know whether they're coming or going. Last November, they actually voted against Bill C-49. And for 10 long years, they had a chance to demonstrate an initiative by modernizing freight rail legislation. Did they do it? No, they were totally absent.
Honourable Member for Ottawa-Vanier. Mr. Speaker, the National Research Council has always played an important role in research and innovation in order to help companies innovate, grow and develop, create new jobs, and improve the health system for all Canadians.
From their work developing canola, an industry that employs over 250,000 Canadians, to their efforts to develop green technologies, the NRC researchers are essential to growing the Canadian economy.
Can the minister tell the House how our government is supporting the NRC's important work? Honourable Minister of Science.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Speaker, our government is committed to supporting research and innovation. I'd like to thank the member for Ottawa-Vanier for having ardently championed research in Canada.
Role in developing new technologies that improve the lives of Canadians. Budget 2018 invested $540 million in the NRC to promote discovery research and to increase research collaboration with academic and industrial partners.
The Honourable Member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Mr. Speaker, Liberals have called the Iranian government elected, but the people of Iran and of the region know that this regime is the leading sponsor of global terror, murder, and violence. While this regime continues to deny responsibility for the murder of Canadians, this Liberal government is helping Iranian officials shop for aircraft with high-level meetings here in Ottawa. Now, selling aircraft may be good for the shareholders of Bombardier, but how does it help the many, many victims? When will this government take off the rose-colored glasses and end their failed appeasement policy?
Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, as long as Mariam Mombaini is not able to leave Iran, the focus of any discussions with Iran will be on getting her home to Canada. I have raised Mrs. Mombaini's situation directly with Iran's ambassador to the UN. I will continue, and our government will continue, to demand answers from the government of Iran on the circumstances surrounding the detention and death of her late husband, Professor Syed Imami. Human rights are important to us around the world, very much including in Iran.
The Honourable Member for Elmwood Transcona.
Last week, in light of concerns about the new central vote in the main estimates, I asked the President of the Treasury Board for a take-note debate on that matter. Today, the Parliamentary Budget Officer confirmed that that vote is riddled with problems that pose serious challenges to parliamentary oversight of government spending. So in light of those concerns, in light of the fact that it's wrong for the government to make unilateral changes to the foundations of Parliament, instead of making it look like the government has something to hide, will the Minister today commit to having a take-note debate in the House on that matter?
President of the Treasury Board.
Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question. Our government respects the work of the Parliamentary Budget Officer, and in fact I spoke with him earlier today and I discussed with him the fact that this is the first time ever that when MPs are voting on the main estimates, they will know initiative by initiative where the budget money is going. This is a huge step forward in terms of parliamentary oversight. We've been very clear that the government is bound by the amounts listed in the allocation for each budget initiative, for instance in Table A211, and to increase any of these initiatives would require further approval by Parliament through the supplementary estimates process. Mr. Speaker, we will continue to raise the bar on openness.
Honourable Member for Steveston, Rich East.
Mr. Speaker, 2017 was the best year ever for tourism in Canada. Close to 21 million tourists visited our country from all over the world, including more than 680,000 visitors from China, which was also a new record. Mr. Speaker, can the Minister of Small Business and Tourism update this House on what our government is doing to welcome more Chinese tourists and what this means for our economy.
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, 2018 is the Canada-China Year of Tourism, and it began with opening ceremonies right here in Canada. As part of our tourism vision, we are committed to doubling the number of Chinese visitors to Canada by 2021. Chinese tourists tend to spend more than the average visitor, so it's a great opportunity for our tourism operators, most of which are small businesses. This year, we will invest $11 million to reach interested Chinese travelers and to support our tourism operators as they welcome more Chinese visitors to cities across Canada. Thanks in part to this investment, and for members like the one from Stevenson, Richmond East, we expect these numbers to continue growing. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Banff Airdrie.
Mr. Speaker, upholding the integrity of our elections is paramount to our democracy. And Canadians are required to show ID to obtain a library card or to rent a car. But the Liberals don't seem to think that ID should be required to vote. The Liberals want to use voter information cards as a proof of address when in the last election nearly 1 million erroneous cards were mailed out. So why is the government going to require people to show photo ID to buy marijuana, but not in order to vote?
All presidents of the Treasury Board.
Mr. Speaker, when the Conservatives in their so-called Fair Elections Act took away vouching and took away voter identification cards, they were warned by hundreds of experts that that would suppress the vote and reduce participation in the Canadian election. They went ahead anyway, and in the 2015 election, according to Stats Canada, over 170,000 Canadians were unable to vote. That's why Elections Canada recommended the restoration of both voter identification card and vouching. That's why we're doing it, Mr. Speaker, because unlike the Conservatives, we think democracy is stronger when more Canadians participate in it.
The Honourable Member for Manicouagan. Mr. Speaker, on October 17th, I tabled Bill C-372 to protect retirees' pension funds and group insurance plans. Later, the NDP tabled a similar bill, and the Liberal Convention came out in favour of similar measures. Even the Leader of the Opposition voted for a similar bill in 2010. Mr. Speaker, let's end this injustice. Today is May 1st. Will the government commit to protecting workers' pension funds before the next election? Yes or no? Honourable Minister for Economic Development.
Mr. Speaker, we've been very clear when it comes to pensions and strengthening pensions that this is a priority. That's why in the budget we clearly outlined a plan to make sure that we have a process in place to secure pensions. This has been a priority for our government. We also strengthen and enhance the CPP as well, and we'll continue to work with the members opposite to strengthen our pension system.
I would like to draw to the attention of honourable members the presence in the gallery of the 2018 Gerhard Hertzberg Canada Gold Medal for Science and Engineering Prize winner, Dr. Louis Kay. And the 2018 John C. Polanyi Prize winner, Dr. Michael Organ. Also with us are the winners of the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council Brockhouse Canada Prize for Interdisciplinary Research in Science and Engineering, Synergy Awards for Innovation, Stacy Memorial Fellowships, and Gilles Brassard Doctoral Prize for Interdisciplinary Research. I have the honour to inform the House that a communication has been received as follows. May 1st, 2018. Mr. Speaker, I have the honour to inform you that the Right Honourable Julie Payette, Governor-General of Canada, signified royal assent by written declaration to the bill listed in the schedule to this letter on the first day of May 2018 at 10:55 a.m. Yours sincerely, Assunta G. Lorenzo. A bill assented to Tuesday, May 1, 2018, an act to amend the Canada Business Corporations Act, the Canada Cooperatives Act, the Canada Not-for-Profit Corporations Act, and the Competition Act, Bill C-25. J'ai l'honneur d'informer la Chambre.
I have the honor to inform the House that a communication has been received on May 1st, 2018. Mr. Speaker, I have the honor to inform you that the Right Honourable Julie Payette, Governor-General of Canada, granted royal assent by written decree to the bills listed in the appendix on May 2nd, 2018. Sincerely, Assunta Di Lorenzo. The bill having received royal assent is an act to amend the Corporations Act, the Canada Cooperatives Act, the Canada Not-for-Profit Corporations Act, and the Competition Act, Bill C-25.
3:10 p.m. pursuant to order made on Thursday, April 26, 2018, the House will now proceed to the taking of the deferred recorded division on the motion of Mr. Angus relating to the business of supply. Calling the members.